Daniel Kim adjusted his worn baseball cap and checked his reflection in the coffee shop window before walking inside. At 32, he was worth over $2 billion as the founder of Kim Technologies, but today he looked like any other struggling young professional in his faded jeans and secondhand jacket. This was his routine now, the carefully crafted persona of a man barely making ends meet, complete with a beat-up Honda Civic, instead of his usual luxury cars and a modest apartment he rented specifically for this purpose. Daniel had grown tired of women who saw dollar signs instead of the person behind his fortune. His last relationship had ended 6 months ago, when he discovered his girlfriend had been secretly photographing his credit cards and researching his net worth online. Before that, there had been Maria, who had accidentally left expensive jewelry catalogs around his penthouse, and Jennifer, who had started planning their wedding after their third date, complete with venue estimates that exceeded most people's annual salaries. Daniel's assistant had set up this coffee date through a mutual friend, describing Sophie Chen as a sweet librarian who loved books and quiet evening. The description sounded promising, but Daniel had learned to be cautious. Even the most innocent-seeming women had surprised him with their sudden interest in his lifestyle once they learned about his wealth. Sophie was already seated at a corner table when Daniel arrived, and he was struck by her natural beauty. She wore a simple cardigan and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she was absorbed in reading a paperback novel while waiting for Sophie? Daniel approached her table, adopting the slightly nervous demeanor of someone who didn't date often. She looked up with a warm smile that seemed completely genuine. "You must be Daniel. I'm so glad to meet you." As Daniel sat down, he noticed that Sophie had ordered just a small coffee, and her purse was a practical canvas bag rather than an expensive designer piece. Everything about her suggested someone who lived modestly by choice or necessity. "I hope you don't mind meeting here," Daniel said, testing her reaction. "I'm kind of between jobs right now, so fancy places are out of my budget." Chapter 2. The First Test. Sophie's expression immediately shifted to one of concern rather than disappointment, which surprised Daniel. Most women would have started making excuses to leave at this point, but Sophie leaned forward with genuine, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," she said softly. "Job hunting can be really stressful. What kind of work are you looking for?" Daniel had prepared for this question, creating a believable backstory about being a freelance web designer who was struggling to find steady clients. He watched Sophie's face carefully as he explained his fictional financial difficulties, expecting to see the familiar signs of a woman calculating whether he was worth her time. Instead, Sophie listened with empathy and understanding. "That sounds really challenging," she said. "I know how hard it can be to make ends meet. I'm a librarian, so I'm not exactly rolling in money either, but I love what I do." Her honesty about her own modest circumstances impressed Dan. Sophie wasn't trying to present herself as more successful than she was, and she seemed completely comfortable with the idea of dating someone who was financially struggling. "Would you like to get some dinner?" Daniel asked, preparing for the real test. "There's a little diner down the street that's pretty cheap." Most of the women Daniel had dated would have suggested somewhere more upscale at this point, or would have suddenly remembered another commitment. Sophie's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That sounds perfect," she said. "I love diners. They have the best comfort food, and you can actually have a conversation without feeling like you need to whisper." As they walked to the diner, Daniel found himself genuinely enjoying Sophie's company. She talked about her work at the library with passion, describing programs she had developed for children and elderly patrons. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Daniel realized he was learning more about her in 30 minutes than he had learned about some women after weeks of dating. The diner was exactly the kind of place Daniel had chosen to test women's reactions. Vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting, and a menu where nothing cost more than $12. Sophie looked around with obvious pleasure, commenting on the cozy atmosphere and the friendly service. Chapter 3. Genuine Connection. Sophie insisted on splitting the check when their modest dinner, pulling out a small wallet and carefully counting out her share of the bill. Daniel was touched by her consideration, especially when she quietly asked if he was sure he could afford his portion. "I don't want you to spend money you don't have," she said with genuine concern. "I'm happy to cover dinner if things are tight right now." The offer was made without condescension or pity, simply one person caring about another's well-being. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years of carefully orchestrated dates and calculated relationships. "I can manage dinner," Daniel assured her, though he was moved by her thoughtfulness. "But thank you for offering. That's really kind of you." As they ate their simple meal of burgers and fries, Daniel found himself forgetting about his deception and simply enjoying Sophie's company. She was intelligent and funny, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard. She talked about her favorite books, her volunteer work at a local animal shelter, and her dreams of eventually opening a community literacy center. "What about you?" Sophie asked. "What do you do when you're not looking for work? What are your hobbies?" Daniel had to think carefully about his answer. His real hobbies included sailing, collecting vintage wines, and traveling to exclusive resorts, none of which fit his current persona. "I like hiking," he said, which was actually true, though he usually hiked on private trails at his mountain estate. "And I read a lot, mostly business books and biographies." Sophie's eyes lit up. "I love that you're a reader. What's the last book that really impressed you?" Daniel found himself in a genuine conversation about literature and ideas, discovering that Sophie was not only well-read, but had thoughtful opinions about everything from economic theory to historical fiction. Her intelligence was evident, but she wore it lightly, never trying to impress or intimidate. As the evening progressed, Daniel realized he was facing an unexpected problem. He had started this date intending to test Sophie's character, but instead he was finding himself genuinely attracted to her mind, her kindness, and her authentic personality. Chapter 4. Growing Feelings. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself looking forward to his dates with Sophie, with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. They met for coffee, took walks in the park, and had picnics with food they prepared together in Sophie's tiny apartment kitchen. Sophie lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment filled with books, plants, and handmade crafts from library patrons. The space was small but warm and inviting, reflecting her personality perfectly. Daniel was struck by how content she seemed with her simple life, finding joy in small pleasures like a perfectly brewed cup of tea or a good book discovered at a used bookstore. "I know this isn't much," Sophie said during his first visit to her apartment, gesturing around the small space with slight embarrassment. "But it's home." "It's perfect," Daniel replied, and he meant it. The apartment had more warmth and personality than his sprawling penthouse, which suddenly seemed cold and impersonal by comparison. Daniel continued his charade of being financially struggling, wearing the same rotation of modest clothes and driving his beat-up Honda to their dates. Sophie never seemed to notice or care about his appearance, focusing instead on their conversations and shared experiences. She often insisted on paying for their activities, worried about Daniel's finances even though he tried to convince her he could afford their modest outings. When they went to a free outdoor concert, Sophie brought homemade sandwiches and lemonade, creating a perfect evening that cost almost nothing. "I hope you don't mind that we don't go to expensive places," Sophie said one evening as they shared a pizza at a neighborhood restaurant. "I know some people expect fancy dinners and shows, but I actually prefer this. It feels more real somehow." Daniel felt a pang of guilt at her words, knowing that his entire relationship was built on deception. But he also felt a growing certainty that Sophie was unlike any woman he had ever met. She was falling in love with a man she believed had nothing to offer except his personality and character. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. What would happen when she discovered the truth about his wealth? Would she feel betrayed by his deception? Or would she be able to understand why he had felt it necessary? Chapter 5. The Proposal. 3 months into their relationship, Daniel knew he was completely in love with Sophie. She had proven herself to be everything he had hoped to find: kind, intelligent, genuine, and completely uninterested in material wealth. But his deception was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and he knew he would have to tell her the truth soon. The decision was made for him when Sophie's landlord suddenly raised her rent by $300 a month, putting her modest apartment beyond her reach on a librarian's salary. Sophie was devastated, not just about having to move, but about the uncertainty of finding another affordable place in the city. "I might have to move back in with my parents," she confided to Daniel over dinner at their usual diner. "I love them, but I'm 26 years old. I thought I was finally independent." Daniel's heart ached seeing her distress, and he wanted nothing more than to solve her problem immediately. He could buy her an apartment, or a house, or an entire building if she wanted. But he knew that offering financial help would expose his deception and potentially destroy their relationship. Instead, Daniel made a decision that surprised even him. That evening, as they walked through the park where they had shared so many conversations, he stopped beside the small pond where ducks gathered in light. "Sophie," he said, his voice more nervous than it had been since their first date. "I know we haven't been together very long, and I know I'm not exactly a great catch financially, but I love you more than I've ever loved." Sophie's eyes widened as Daniel dropped to one knee, pulling out a simple ring he had bought with cash at a modest. It wasn't the kind of ring he could have afforded, but it was chosen with love and, "Will you marry me?" Daniel, his heart pounding her response. Sophie's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Daniel, yes, of course yes, but are you sure? I mean, we're both struggling financially, and marriage is expensive, and..." Daniel stood and pulled her into his arms, silencing her practical concerns with a kiss. "We'll figure it out together," he promised, knowing that he would have to reveal his true circumstances soon. Chapter 6. Wedding Plan. Sophie threw herself into planning their wedding with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else. but Daniel could see her constantly worrying about the cost. She researched budget venues, looked for sales on wedding dresses, and suggested a guest list of only immediate family and closest friends. "I found a community center that only charges $200 for the evening," Sophie announced excitedly during one of their planning sessions. "And my friend Maria knows someone who does photography as a side business. She might give us a discount." Daniel watched Sophie carefully calculating every expense, trying to create the wedding of her dreams within the constraints of what she believed their combined modest incomes could afford. Her determination to make their day special despite financial limitations both impressed and pained him. "Sophie," Daniel said gently, "what if we had a little more money for the wedding? Would you want something different?" Sophie looked up from her notebook of budget calculations with surprise. "Where would we get more money?" "Daniel, I don't want you to go into debt for one day. We can have a beautiful wedding without spending a fortune." Her practical approach to their finances made Daniel realize how different she was from the women who had tried to plan elaborate weddings on his credit cards. Sophie genuinely wanted to marry him, not throw an expensive party to impress others. "What if I told you I had some savings I hadn't mentioned?" Daniel asked carefully, testing how she might react to the revelation of hidden wealth. Sophie's expression grew concerned. "Daniel, you told me you were struggling to find work. If you have savings, shouldn't you be using that money for rent and groceries instead of a wedding?" Her response confirmed what Daniel already knew. Sophie's priorities were completely aligned with what she believed was best for their future together. She wasn't interested in spending money they couldn't afford, even on their own wedding. "You're right," Daniel said, postponing his revelation once again. "Let's stick with the budget plan." As they continued planning their modest wedding, Daniel found himself falling even deeper in love with Sophie's practical wisdom and genuine values. But he also knew that he couldn't marry her without telling her the truth about who he really was. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. 2 weeks before their wedding, Daniel knew he couldn't wait any longer to reveal his true identity. He had arranged for Sophie to meet him at what she thought was another budget restaurant, but was actually the private dining room of the city's most exclusive hotel. Sophie arrived wearing her best dress, a simple but elegant piece she had bought on sale for special occasions. She looked confused when the maître d' escorted her to the private dining room where Daniel waited, no longer wearing his usual modest clothes but dressed in an expensive suit. "Daniel?" Sophie looked around the elegant room with bewilderment. "What is this place? How did you afford this?" Daniel stood as she approached, his heart pounding with nervousness about how she would react to his deception. "Sophie, please sit down. I have something very important to tell you." Sophie remained standing, her expression growing more confused and concerned. "Daniel, you're scaring me. What's going on? Did you borrow money for this? We can't afford." "Sophie," Daniel interrupted gently, "I can afford this. I can afford anything you could ever want. I'm not a struggling web designer. I'm Daniel Kim, the founder and CEO of Kim Technologies." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language, her mind clearly struggling to process what he had just told her. "You're… what?" she whispered finally. "I'm a billionaire," Daniel said quietly. "I've been pretending to be poor because I wanted to find someone who would love me for who I am, not what I have." Sophie sank into her chair, her face pale with shock. "You've been lying to me for months? About everything?" "Not about everything," Daniel said urgently. "Not about loving you. Not about wanting to marry you. Those feelings are completely real." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but Daniel couldn't tell if they were tears of hurt, anger, or something else entirely. "I don't understand. Why would you do this to me?" Daniel sat across from her, desperate to make her understand. "Because every woman I've ever dated has wanted my money more than they wanted. You're the first person who loved me when you thought I had nothing to offer except myself." Chapter 8. The Confrontation. Sophie sat in stunned silence for several minutes, her hands trembling as she tried to process Daniel's revelation. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Everything I know about you is a lie," she said, not looking at your job, your apartment, your car, your struggles. All of it was fake. "My feelings for you were never fake," Daniel said desperately. "Sophie, you have to believe that. I fell in love with you because of who you are. Your kindness, your intelligence, your beautiful heart. None of that had anything to do with money." Sophie finally looked up at him, and Daniel was devastated to see hurt and betrayal in her eyes. "But you didn't trust me enough to be honest with me. You thought I was the kind of person who would only love you for your money. I didn't know you," Daniel protested. "I had to protect myself. I've been hurt so many times by women who saw me as a bank account instead of a person. So you decided to test me?" Sophie's voice was growing stronger, anger beginning to replace shock. "You turned our entire relationship into some kind of experiment to see if I would pass your character evaluation?" Daniel realized how his deception must look from her perspective, manipulative and condescending. as if he had assumed she was guilty until proven innocent. "Sophie, I know how this looks, but please try to understand." "Understand what?" Sophie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "That you thought I was probably a gold digger? That you assumed I couldn't be trusted with the truth about who you are?" "That's not," Daniel began, but Sophie cut him off. "Do you have any idea how this makes me feel?" She continued, her voice breaking. "I've been worried about your finances for months. I've insisted on paying for things because I thought you couldn't afford them. I've been planning a budget wedding because I thought we were both struggling." Daniel felt sick as he realized the full impact of his deception. Sophie had been trying to protect him financially, had been testing her character, creating an imbalance in their relationship that must have been exhausting. "I was trying to take care of you," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. "And you were lying to me the entire time." Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Sophie left the restaurant that night without giving Daniel a chance to explain further, and she didn't answer his calls or texts for 3 days. Daniel was beside himself with regret and fear that he had lost the only woman he had ever truly loved because of his inability to trust. When Sophie finally agreed to meet him, it was at the small park where they had shared so many conversations during their courtship. She looked tired and sad, and Daniel could see that she had been crying. "I've been thinking about everything you told me," Sophie said without preamble. "And I understand why you felt you needed to protect yourself, but I can't understand why you continued the deception for so long after you knew what kind of person I was." Daniel had been asking himself the same question. "I was scared," he admitted. "I was scared that if you knew the truth, you would change. That you would start seeing me differently, wanting different things from our relationship." "So you decided that was your choice to make?" Sophie asked. "You decided when and how I would learn the truth about the man I was falling in love with?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He had been so focused on protecting himself that he hadn't considered how his deception violated Sophie's right to make informed decisions about their relationship. "You're right," Daniel said quietly. "I took away your choice. I made decisions about our relationship based on my fears, instead of trusting you with the truth." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the pond where Daniel had proposed just weeks earlier. "The worst part," she said finally, "is that I keep wondering what else you might be hiding. If you could lie about something so fundamental for months, how do I know what's real about you?" Daniel felt his heart breaking as he realized the depth of damage his deception had caused. "Everything else is real," he said desperately. "My feelings for you, my personality, my values, those are all genuine. But how can I be sure?" Sophie asked, finally looking at him. "You're an expert at deception, Dan. You convinced me completely that you were someone else entirely." Daniel saw his future with Sophie slipping away, and knew he had to find a way to prove his sincerity. "What can I do to show you that my love is? Tell me what you need from." Chapter 10. The Decision. Sophie asked for time to think, and Daniel gave her the space she needed, while hoping desperately that she would find a way to forgive him. A week later, she called and asked him to meet her at the library where she worked. Daniel found her in the children's section, reading to a group of preschoolers. He watched from a distance as she brought the story to life with different voices and animated expressions, seeing again the genuine warmth and kindness that had made him fall in love with her. When the reading session ended, and the children had been picked up by their parents, Sophie approached Daniel with a serious expression. "I've made a decision," she said without "I can't marry you." Daniel felt the world collapse around him, but Sophie held up her hand before he could speak. "I can't marry you now, under these circumstances," she continued. "But I'm willing to start over if you are." Daniel looked at her with confusion and hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean we go back to the beginning," Sophie explained. "You be honest about who you are, and I'll get to know the real Daniel Kim. No deception, no testing, just two people learning about each other." Daniel felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "You're willing to give me another chance?" "I'm willing to give us another chance," Sophie, "because despite everything, I believe that what we felt for each other was real. But we need to build a relationship based on truth this time." Daniel nodded eagerly. "Yes, absolutely. Whatever you want, whatever you..." Sophie smiled for the first time since his revelation. "I want to meet the real Daniel Kim. I want to see where you really live, meet your friends, understand your world, and I want you to be patient while I learn to trust you." "What about the wedding?" Daniel asked. "We'll postpone it," Sophie said simply. "When we're ready to get married, if we're ready, we'll plan a wedding that reflects who we really are together." Daniel felt tears in his eyes as he realized that Sophie was offering him something more precious than forgiveness. She was offering him the chance to build a genuine relationship based on honesty and mutual respect. Chapter 11. Starting over. Daniel's real apartment was a penthouse that took up the entire top floor of one of the city's most exclusive buildings. As Sophie stepped off the private elevator into his home, Daniel watched her reaction carefully, trying to gauge how she felt about seeing his actual lifestyle. Sophie walked slowly through the spacious rooms, taking in the expensive artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows, and luxurious furnishings. Her expression was thoughtful, rather than impressed or overwhelmed. "It's beautiful," she said finally, "but it doesn't feel like you." Daniel was surprised by her observation. "What do you mean?" "It's like a magazine spread," Sophie explained. "Perfect but impersonal. Where are your books? Your photos? The things that show who you are as a person?" Daniel realized that Sophie was right. His penthouse was a showcase of wealth, but revealed nothing about his personality or interests. In contrast, her small apartment had been filled with evidence of her passions and relationships. "I guess I never thought about making it feel like home, Daniel. I was always working or traveling." Over the following weeks, Daniel introduced Sophie to his real world gradually. She met his assistant, his business partners, and his few genuine friends. Sophie was polite and interested, but Daniel could see her observing everything carefully, trying to understand this new version of the man she thought she had known. The most difficult moment came when they attended a charity gala together, Sophie's first exposure to the social world that came with Daniel's wealth. She wore a simple black dress that looked elegant but modest compared to the designer gowns around her. Daniel watched Sophie navigate conversations with society figures and business leaders, impressed by her natural grace and intelligence. But he could also see her discomfort with the ostentatious display of wealth and the superficial nature of many interactions. "This is your work," Sophie said quietly during a break in the evening's program. "Part of it, Daniel, but not the part that matters to me." Sophie studied his face. "What part does matter to you?" Daniel thought about her question seriously. "The work itself, building something useful, creating jobs, solving problems, and now, you matter to me more than any of this." Chapter 12. Rebuilding Trust. As months passed, Daniel and Sophie slowly rebuilt their relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual understanding. Sophie learned about Daniel's business, his philanthropic work, and his genuine passion for technology and innovation. Daniel learned about Sophie's dreams of expanding literacy programs and her desire to make education accessible to underserved communities. They discovered that despite their different backgrounds, they shared similar values about using their abilities to help others. Daniel was impressed by Sophie's intelligence and vision, while Sophie came to appreciate Daniel's work ethic and genuine desire to make a positive impact. The turning point came when Sophie's library faced budget cuts that would eliminate several community programs. Without being asked, Daniel quietly arranged for his foundation to provide funding to maintain the program, but he made sure Sophie learned about it from her supervisor, rather than from him. "You didn't tell me you were helping the library," Sophie said when she called him that. "I didn't want you to feel obligated to thank me," Daniel replied. "I did it because the programs are important, not to impress you." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "That's how I know you've changed," she said finally. "The old Daniel would have made sure I knew he was the hero. This Daniel just did what was right." 6 months after their restart, Daniel and Sophie were walking through the same park where he had first proposed, when Sophie stopped beside the pond. "I have something to tell you," she said, her expression serious. Daniel felt his heart rate increase, worried that she had decided their relationship wasn't working after all. "I love you," Sophie said simply. "Not the broke web designer I thought I was dating, and not the billionaire who can solve all my problems. I love Daniel Kim, the real person behind both of those facades." Daniel felt tears in his eyes as he realized that Sophie had given him something he had never thought possible. Love, based on complete knowledge and acceptance of who he really was. "I love you too," he replied, "and I promise I will never lie to you again about anything, no matter how small." Sophie smiled and reached into her purse, pulling out the simple engagement ring Daniel had given her months earlier. "I think it's time to put this back on," she said. Chapter 13. The Real Wedding. A year later, Daniel and Sophie were married in a ceremony that perfectly reflected their journey together. The venue was the library where Sophie transformed with flowers and lights into an elegant but intimate space. The guest list included Daniel's business associates, alongside Sophie's library colleagues, creating a unique blend of their two worlds. Sophie wore a beautiful but not ostentatious wedding dress, and Daniel wore a suit that was expensive but understated. Their vows focused on honesty, trust, and their shared commitment to using their resources, both financial and personal, to help others. The reception was held in the library's main hall, with catering that was elegant but not excessive. Daniel had wanted to spare no expense, but Sophie had insisted on a celebration that felt authentic to who they were as a couple. "This is perfect," Sophie whispered to Daniel as they danced to their first song as husband and wife. "It's not too simple?" Daniel asked, still sometimes worrying that Sophie was settling for less than she deserved. "It's exactly right," Sophie assured him. "It's honest, it's beautiful, and it's us." As they danced surrounded by friends and family, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. His deception had nearly cost him the love of his life, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about trust, honesty, and the difference between love and attraction to wealth. Sophie had proven herself to be everything Daniel had hoped to find. A woman who loved him for his character rather than his bank account. But more importantly, she had shown him how to be worthy of that love by demanding honesty and authenticity in their relationship. Their marriage was built on a foundation of truth, mutual respect, and shared values. Daniel knew that he had found not just a wife, but a true partner who would challenge him to be his best self, while loving him exactly as he was. As the evening concluded and they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a modest trip to a cabin in the mountains that Sophie had chosen, Daniel realized that his test had ultimately revealed more about himself than about the women he had dated. Sophie had taught him that true love required vulnerability, trust, and the courage to be completely authentic with another person. The billionaire who had pretended to be broke had found something more valuable than all his wealth, a love that was genuine, lasting, and built on the solid foundation of truth.